On today's World Insight, the art of modern Chinese literature with a wide global appeal thanks to faithful translation. Ge Fei, the prize-winning author of the U.S. National Book Award-shortlisted work Peach Blossom Paradise, talks about the creative process and why history matters a lot to Chinese writers.
In my opinion, the world is becoming smaller every day, and this refers to the fact that the development of technology and the ease of transportation have made the Earth smaller and smaller while more and more crowded.
And meet the Peach Blossom Paradise translator Canaan Morse, who says translation is a crucial but often misunderstood art.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Literature provides a unique lens into our understanding of the human experience and each other. And this year, many English readers embarked on a fictional journey set in late 20th century China through a young woman named Xiu Mi, who came of age during a turbulent time in Chinese history. The book is Peach Blossom Paradise, written by Chinese novelist Ge Fei and translated into English by Canaan Morse, a well-known young translator. It was shortlisted for the prestigious National Book Award in the U.S. In today's program, I talked to both the author and the translator about stories behind the book and why translated literature matters in today's world. First up, novelist Ge Fei, who began publishing short stories in the 1980s and quickly established himself as a forerunner of experimental contemporary literature in China. In 2016, he was awarded the Maodun Literature Prize. Peach Blossom Paradise is his third book to be translated into English. Here is my conversation with Professor Ge Fei. Can you tell me more about this book itself and also your cooperation with the translator?
对，因为这个我们因为作品在国外不同语种的这个
More and more of our books are being translated into different languages. I think one important criterion for judging a good translator is whether he or she asks you questions. Some translators don't ask any questions when translating your work. Then you'll be quite worried, because the translator may not understand everything in your book clearly.
心里打鼓的，因为有很多的东西，你觉得他不一定能够了解的那么清晰。
Canaan Morse, who translated my book Peach Blossom Paradise, constantly asked me questions while doing the translation. And then there were some issues that, to be honest, I wrote wrong at first. For example, sometimes the chronology was inaccurate, and he spotted them all. He was also very careful about the layout of the house in my book. For instance, there is a garden. He would ask me where the garden should be facing. So I think this translator is one of the best translators I have come across over the years.
特别好的一个翻译啊。
He told me also he has tremendous respect for you personally and also your work. He said you work very hard. You answer very carefully every question he raised. I thought there must be something going on, camaraderie between the writer and the translator.
是的，那么这个我呢一直是这么想，这个比如说在汉学界啊，美国的汉学界。
Many of the older generation of American sinologists are well known to Chinese readers and writers, like Howard Goldblatt, who translated Mo Yan's novels. They are great translators. Canaan Morse translated my first book, The Invisibility Cloak, which won the Susan Sontag Award in the U.S. I particularly like his translation style, which is very lucid and charming, and I have always considered him to be a very outstanding representative of the new generation of American translators.
翻译家里面的一个非常杰出的一个代表。 我有一年到哥伦比亚去。
Once I went to Columbia University to give a lecture. Canaan Morse translated the whole lecture. The professor who hosted the lecture was so surprised that he said the translator could even translate many specialized things I mentioned. He had never seen such a translation before.
都非常吃惊，说这个翻译这些东西都能翻出来，说他从来没见过。
Tell me more about what exactly this work you're trying to tell the readers. And as a result of translation, do you think you have achieved your goal?
我自己觉得有各种不同的层面，我们可以来回答或者来解释这个问题。
I think we can answer the question from different aspects. In my opinion, the world is becoming smaller every day, and this refers to the fact that the development of technology and the ease of transportation have made the Earth smaller and smaller while more and more crowded, and some things in faraway places are disappearing.
那么这个远方这些东西都在消失掉。
In addition, as utilitarian thinking runs rampant around the world, people are thinking and doing things based on their own perspective, their own values, and their own interests. In this way, the space among individuals has also become very small. That is, we are deprived of a wider range of ideas and different views on life. Therefore, I think what I hope to communicate with my readers is to understand different civilizations and cultures as well as to respect the feelings of different individuals.
这些方面呢，我觉得是最希望和读者交流的。
Professor Gefei, I'm extremely interested in what you said about this communication. As you know, it's not just about showcase yourself, it's also about tell it directly, purely, genuinely, not exaggeration, not talking small. That's not the easy thing when it comes to cross-cultural communications. What about for literature?
就是我觉得你提了一个特别好的，我觉得也是特别有专业性的这样一个问题。
I think you have raised a particularly good and professional question. I think in literary creation, there are actually two authors. One author is me myself, who has many limitations and shortcomings, and is always influenced by certain worldviews and values and other issues. The second author is the one who changes during the process of creation. We have to meet ourselves, and writing is actually to meet a better version of ourselves, a broader version of ourselves, and the version of ourselves that we hope to become. These things will gradually occur when we create literature. A well-known example is the famous Lev Tolstoy, who often ran counter to his own worldview. It is through creating literature that we discover so many things inside ourselves that are alien to us, as well as so many things that are better for us. That is one of the most important attractions of literary creation.
所以这是创作当中最重要的魅力之一吧。
Tell me more about the second yourself. What kind of yourself you have discovered?
对，这个在创作过程中，一个年轻的作者，尤其是
A young author, especially the one who is just starting writing, is confronted with an extraordinary amount of advice. For example, masters in the past such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Anton Chekhov all give a piece of advice to young writers. In the 1980s, when authors like me first started writing, we took their advice to heart. The advice is that a young author has to start his or her work in a new way, which means you couldn't rest on the laurels of predecessors and mimic another author's writing style. And I always tell my students this. Many students say that I am not competent enough, or I don't have enough social experience. They ask how they can face a difficult job. So I remind my students that you may not have enough experience on literary creation, but you have the best thing, which is your extraordinary courage, the courage of young authors who dare to innovate. Since you are not burdened, you're not famous, and no one knows your work.
所以我是觉得很多人其实修养更好了。
Many authors have become more cultivated and more experienced, but the shining points in their work have disappeared. This in turn shows that the courage to innovate and experiment, as well as the enthusiasm to explore the unknown world, play a big role in creating literature. I think the reason why we are called vanguards is that we happen to be at a time of great social and cultural change. In that era, we had our own mission and task.
那么在那个时代里边，我觉得我们有我们自己的使命和任务，哎。
You're well known for being avant-garde in the 1980s in China's literature. However, right now, you have also been emphasizing over the past 15 years or so about traditional Chinese novels, the structures, the content, and the language. Tell me more about that, about why you think the latter is very important to you.
对，这个我们因为刚开始自己的创作生涯的时候呢，基本上
When we first started writing novels, we read tons of foreign books, especially novels from the Western countries. Sometimes when we visited overseas and met our foreign colleagues, they would be very surprised, saying how you Chinese were so familiar with our books. In fact, this was very common at the time. There was also the influence of well-known Chinese author Lu Xun on us, who said that if we read more foreign books, we would understand more about other countries. But as time went on, there were always some voices reminding us, including voices from many foreign friends, saying that it was not good for you to keep writing like this. While young people in their 20s had different choices, but for those of us in our 30s, if we did not seriously refresh our knowledge of Chinese culture, what else could we do in the future? I once read a very famous essay, T.S. Eliot, titled Tradition and Individual Talent, Selected Essays. One of the most important points in this essay is that if you want to continue to write when you grow up, you have to know history very well.
那么你还要继续创作的话，那你对你自身的历史要非常了解才行。
So I began doing research about traditional Chinese narrative works, starting with the Spring and Autumn Annals and the commentary of Zuo, to Dream of Red Chamber, and I discovered a lot of things that I would never think about before. For example, I used to think that the West was the West and China was China. But when I began to study the Golden Lotus, the Water Margin, and Dream of the Red Chamber, and the evolution of the Chinese chapter and verse novel, I found out that even though China had not been influenced by the West at that time, a process of what the Japanese call modernization had actually begun within China in the 15th and 16th centuries. In fact, I wrote a book on the relationship between the Golden Lotus and the theory of the famous philosopher Wang Yangming, and I addressed the question of what was happening in China in the 16th century. If you compare it with the West, you'll find out that Chinese literature is really remarkable. The height it had reached, the maturity of its work, is very surprising at that time.
那个作品之成熟，有的时候是非常令人吃惊的。
For example, when we talk about the awakening of thoughts, how was Neo-Confucianism replaced by Wang Yangming's philosophy, and how did human desire come to be part of the so-called heavenly principle? In the Song dynasty, there was a saying that human desires were opposed to the God-given truth. But today we believe that it is normal to have desires. So, isn't it a big question how desire can suddenly become part of the God-given principle? When I was thinking about this, the material I found was the Golden Lotus, a novel of that period. This kind of research is very worthwhile, since the study of traditional Chinese narratives can help us clarify a lot of questions in history.
对中国传统叙事的研究呢，可以帮助我们澄清很多的问题。
That was my conversation with Chinese novelist Ge Fei, whose translated book, Peach Blossom Paradise, was a finalist for this year's National Book Award in the U.S. After the break, we meet the book's translator, Canaan Morse, who says translation is a crucial but often misunderstood art. What he meant? Well, stay tuned. The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. In the first part of today's program, I talked to Chinese novelist Ge Fei, whose 2007 book Peach Blossom Paradise was translated and published in English last year and became a finalist for this year's National Book Award for Translated Literature. Now let's meet the translator, Canaan Morse, who has done the first English translation of Gefei's work, The Invisibility Cloak, nearly a decade ago. It won him the Susan Sontag Prize for translation in 2014 in the US. Since falling in love with China at the age of 5, according to Morse, he has dedicated his life so far to the study of Chinese culture. While studying in China, he co-founds Past Light magazine, which introduces contemporary Chinese poetry to English readers. Now back in the US, Morse is a PhD candidate at Harvard with a focus on late imperial Chinese literature. Morse told me he thinks translation is a vital but often misunderstood art. What does he mean? Let's find out. I'm joined now by Canaan Morse, literary translator, poet, and PhD candidate at Harvard University. Canaan, what a pleasure to see you. You know, a writer would work sometimes not necessarily controlling everything that he wrote. And at the end of the day, in retrospect, he might have different interpretations of what he really meant, really. When you consulted with him and work in that style, you know, I'm sure there are some interesting messages coming out about his writing, about how he works, and about how English and Chinese languages work.
One of the important, I should say, corollary advantages of communicating frequently with an author as a translator is that it builds an atmosphere of trust. I trust him and he trusts me. And I value his respect and his trust so much that it motivates me to be a better translator. As one famous translator said, when I create a translated document, 100% of the words that I use are not the words in the original text.
That's true.
I think people get caught on that a lot, but it's important to realize that it is a process of multi-vocal recreation.
You talk about recreation. Actually, there's also a process of co-creation. Because as a translator, you also need to work out the storyline with your own understanding and put it out in a language that you are familiar with to the readers you are targeting at. And try to explain things sometimes that is not in the original text. So that's a very interesting, way of working for translators everywhere.
For instance, if someone says, 我不会当你的陈世美, okay? This is so 陈世美, right? We have here a character from ancient Chinese history who is an unfaithful husband, like he's sort of like an inconstant lover, right? And what I will do, actually, I may use the name in English, but I would probably fortify the meaning by changing the verbs around it so that my reader understands that the person is saying, I'm not going to abandon you. And every context is different. I mean, the thing about translation is that every sentence is different. Every sentence involves different choices. But within those choices, we have the space to include information in a way that's not like totally obvious, that is included, that is culturally specific. We don't have to use footnotes. People used to use footnotes, but we no longer do that because it's kind of hard
distracting.
to read.
Yeah. Tell me more about how difficult and challenging Gefei's works are, and how is that uniquely different and challenging from the other works you've been trying to translate?
One of the reasons that I love translating Gefei's work is his incredible degree of succinctness. What the style we describe in Chinese as 凝练, he can put an incredible amount of information into a very, very small amount of language. I started translating his work with a much more recent book called Yin Shen Yi, The Invisibility Cloak. And, that's a novella of only 68,000 characters or so. And it feels like a whole novel. And the same is true of Peach Blossom Paradise. I mean, there's just so much in there. And it's beautiful and moving prose in Chinese. It just means that there's a lot of pressure on me to
Absolutely.
create an English style that will communicate that same level of intensity.
Then, Canaan, how did you find that style?
Through practice and communication and editorship. My editor, Jeffrey Yang at New York View Books, he's an amazing reader. And without his...
What is an amazing reader to you?
An amazing reader to me is someone who can look at a draft translation and see where it's probably missing something or where it could be better, even when they're not looking at an original.
You would not lose that much in translation as long as you're only reading it, literally. But you could feel, if your reader is bilingual, there is some loss of spirit or loss of real essence, loss of cross-cultural communication, loss of colloquialism, and the list goes on in the translation. And that's something that no translator could escape, right? Nobody could escape. Only the degree varies. So how do you face that, particularly with Gefei's work, who, as you said, wrote in a way that is so concise and precise, and with a lot of cultural context?
So translation, if we think about it historically, translation has been with us since the dawn of human civilization.
Sure.
And it is translation, in fact, it is one of the ways in which most cultures find new energy, is through translation. We've been translating each other's work, other humans' work, since the dawn of time. I would suggest that translation can make a lot of work. It makes for a richer cultural experience, put it that way. There's a very famous quote that people attribute to Robert Frost about poetry being what is lost in translation. Accomplished poets and translators have come back to that and said, well, yes, but without translation, there would be almost no poetry at all. And I think I and a lot of translators who know what it is like to work with an author. I think in a lot of, we talk a lot about loss in translation when we read works that have been translated colonially, in which the translator is stepping in front of the author. But in today's world, a responsible translator knows that you stand next to or behind your author. And when you do that, you're able to work both with content and with style, because you mentioned the phrase literal translation. And I think as anyone who's ever read a Google machine translation knows, when you translate literally, you get unreadable work. And, with most authors, it's just as much about how you say what you say as it is about what you say. Style is the message. And they want to work with literary people, writers, translators who understand that and who can replicate context. I mean, so much of reading a story is not just about the specific information on the page, it's about recreating the feeling of reading a story. When I read 人面桃花, how do I feel? Like,
how
does
do
that
you feel?
context? I love unhappy stories. I don't like happy endings. And this is
That's not very Chinese. We love a double happiness.
It's true, but I'm sorry to tell you, no one gets married at the end of this story.
Okay.
But it's like it's so complex and dark and like mysterious. Like you can see reading the 江南三部曲, you can see that his trilogy, you can see where the Invisibility Cloak and all the later work comes from, like his ability to create suspense and work with darkness and uncertainty.
To the other generations of writers in China, Mr. Guo Fei is still very active, shall I say even proactive, in both writing the works and interact with societies, teaching students. And some of his peers of the same generation are doing the same at various degrees in different ways. So how do you, look at a whole Google map of Chinese contemporary literature and locate these guys or these ladies on the map?
Guo Fei's generation of authors have been through many different literary movements and historical movements. And one of the things you notice about his generation, particularly of prose writers, is they started out, many of them, writing sort of broad scope historical fiction. So if we look at Guo Fei, we look at Mo Yan, we look at Jia Pinghua, this generation of prose authors, they each have at least one major piece of history spanning historical fiction. So there's a certain concern with change and continuity that moved them to write really sweeping narratives at one point. And many of these authors, having done that, have then gone back to focus on more sort of micro issues, sort of like core moments of human experience. And that's been an interesting change to watch.
Like what? What are these core moments of human experience?
For instance, like I think a lot of those writers were deeply affected by the changes that occurred in Chinese society in terms of reform and opening up. When people had things to buy, when there's so much more stuff to buy, when there was so much more money to make, and when people started to change some of their priorities based on their capabilities, that I think has really hit, especially writers who came from perhaps from rural backgrounds. I think those changes have been extreme and quite new and worthy of attention.
Well, that was my conversation with Canaan Morse, a rising translator now based in the United States, who is fascinated with Chinese culture and certainly literature. His latest translation of Chinese novelist Guo Fei's work has already achieved to be on the short list for this year's National Book Award in the U.S. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.